He thought he was buying a woman. He was wrong. On a ledger in Georgia, Betty Moore was written down as property, a body, a price, a future worker. But ledgers lie when they pretend a human being can be reduced to ink. This is the record of what they took from her, and what they failed to kill. The Atlantic did not simply carry ships in 1792, it carried evidence. That year, a vessel called the Prosperity crossed the ocean with more than 300 captive Africans locked below deck. The name was not an accident. It was a confession. Prosperity for the men who owned the ship. Prosperity for the buyers waiting in Georgia. Prosperity built from chains, sickness, stolen names, and bodies packed so tightly that breathing became labor. In the lower hold among the chained women was Ada. She had been taken from the Gold Coast. Before the kidnapping, she had been a healer. She knew roots, births, fevers, and prayers. She knew the names of her people. She knew the sound of a village before fire reached it. By the time the ship entered the Atlantic crossing, almost all of that had been stripped from her in the eyes of the men above deck. To them, she was cargo with a swollen belly. The child inside her moved. There are records that count bodies. There are fewer records that count screams. And yet every slave ship had both. Ada's labor began in the dark, on wet boards, with iron at her wrists and ankles. The women near her could not move freely enough to hold her. They could only lean as close as the chains allowed and whisper strength into the air. Some prayed in languages the sailors did not understand. Some sang low so the men above would not come down angry. The ship rose and dropped against the sea. Ada pushed while the hold stank of salt water, waste, blood, and fear. No doctor came. No mercy came. Above deck, one of the officers was told another captive woman was giving birth. His answer was simple. If the baby lived, it would increase the value of the shipment. If it died, it would be thrown away with the rest of the loss. That was the arithmetic of the Atlantic trade. A girl was born before dawn. For a moment there was silence. Then the child cried. Small at first, then strong enough to cut through the hold. Ada pulled the baby to her chest as far as the chains allowed. The women around her understood what had happened. Life had arrived inside a machine built for death. Ada named her Betty. The name was not protection. It was witness. When the hatch opened, lantern light fell across the captives. A sailor came down and took the newborn from Ada's arms. He lifted Betty as if weighing an animal. He looked at her limbs, her face, her lungs. He was not welcoming a child into the world. He was inspecting future property. Ada reached for her daughter and was held back by iron. The sailor returned the baby only after deciding she might survive the voyage. Betty cried against her mother's chest. Ada held her close and whispered words the men above deck would not write down. Words about memory. Words about freedom. Words about the life stolen before the child could understand it had been stolen. 3 weeks later, the ship reached Savannah, Georgia. The captives were brought up into daylight. Some could barely stand. Some had lost family during the crossing. Some had stopped speaking. The dock was loud with gulls, orders, boots, and buyers. Men walked through the newly arrived captives with the calm attention of merchants examining livestock. They touched arms, checked teeth, asked ages, argued prices. This was not chaos. It was business. Ada stood with Betty in her arms. She had survived childbirth at sea. She had survived the hold. She had survived the crossing. Survival in that place did not mean safety. It meant she was ready to be sold. A planter named Elias Hawthorne examined her. He owned land upriver, a plantation spread across red Georgia soil near the Savannah River. Cotton, labor, debt, punishment. Those were the pillars of his world. He saw Ada's strength. He saw the infant. He saw inconvenience and profit in the same glance. A woman with a baby could not produce full labor immediately, but a baby girl could grow. A baby girl could be trained. A baby girl could one day pick cotton, clean rooms, bear children, and increase the estate. Hawthorne bought them both. Betty Moore entered Georgia not as an immigrant, not as a daughter, not as a child protected by law. She entered as property attached to another property. Her life had a price before it had a memory. The wagon carried Ada and Betty away from Savannah. Behind them was the port. Ahead of them was Hawthorne Plantation. The road was red clay. Dust rose beneath the wheels. Ada looked back once toward the ocean. Somewhere beyond it was the land from which she had been taken. Somewhere behind that water were graves, names, songs, and a version of herself that had not yet been chained. She held Betty tighter. "You remember," she whispered. The child could not understand. But the mother said it anyway, because memory was the first resistance left to them. Hawthorne Plantation stood like a white lie on a hill. The main house had columns, porches, polished wood, and rooms cooled by the forced labor of black hands. Behind it, down a dirt path, stood the quarters, rough cabins. Crowded floors, thin blankets, smoke, hunger, and the constant knowledge that no family inside those walls was safe from sale. Betty grew there. By 5 years old, she understood commands before she understood law. She knew when to lower her eyes. She knew the sound of the bell. She knew the difference between the footsteps of field hands and the footsteps of overseers. She knew that white children could run freely across the yard, while black children learned stillness as a means of survival. Her father was called Jim by the plantation, though his own people had known him as Kwame. He had been brought to Hawthorne from another plantation. He was strong, marked by work, and still carried some piece of himself that the owners had failed to erase. That piece was dangerous. A black man who remembered his own dignity was a threat in a place built on denying it. The overseer, Cyrus Boone, recognized that threat. Boone was not a rare monster. That is the point history often tries to soften. Men like him were useful to slavery. They enforced the system with rope, fear, and public pain. They were hired hands of a larger crime. One summer day, under brutal Georgia heat, Kwame paused in the field to wipe sweat from his face. It lasted only a moment. Boone saw it. He rode over and accused him of laziness. Kwame answered carefully. But he looked up too long. That was enough. The bell was rung. The workers were called in. Betty stood beside Ada as the plantation gathered around the whipping post, an old oak whose bark had darkened from years of punishment. Hawthorne watched from the house. He did not need to raise the whip. Ownership allowed him to outsource violence and still benefit from it. Kwame was tied to the tree. 20 lashes were ordered. Betty saw the whip rise. She saw her mother's face harden. She heard the first strike and felt the crowd go still. The lesson was not only for the man tied to the oak, it was for every person forced to watch. Slavery punished one body to instruct many. Betty asked why they were hurting her father. Ada turned the child's face away, but turning away did not erase the sound. That day planted something in Betty that would not leave. Not childish anger, something colder, a record inside the body, a ledger of the opposite kind, not prices paid by buyers but debts owed by those who believed power erased guilt. Years passed. Betty learned field work. She learned hunger. She learned the rules of silence. She learned which plants healed wounds and which could harm. She learned stories from the elders, stories of Africa, of ancestors, of people who had once lived without passes, patrols, auctions, or chains. And secretly, she learned to read. An older enslaved man named Thomas helped her, letter by letter, word by word. It was forbidden because the owners understood what literacy could do. A person who could read could compare law to justice. A person who could read could see the fraud beneath the master's Bible. A person who could read could remember beyond what the plantation permitted. Betty was 8 when Silas Crow arrived. He came in a fine carriage dressed in black, with iron cages behind him and business in his smile. The people in the quarters already knew his type. A traitor, a separator of mothers and children, a man who turned grief into commission. He spoke with Hawthorne near the main house. Cotton prices were low, debts were rising, bodies would be sold to balance accounts. The enslaved people were lined up. Crow walked among them, choosing. Then he stopped at Ada. He took her chin in his hand and turned her face as if inspecting an object. Hawthorne described her value. Strong worker, healthy children, good field hand. Crow agreed to buy her. Betty heard the decision before she understood how final it was. She ran forward screaming for her mother. The overseer struck her down. From the dirt, Betty watched Ada's wrists chained. She watched her mother placed in Crow's wagon. Ada did not beg for herself. She looked at Betty and gave the only inheritance left. "Remember who you are?" The wagon pulled away. Betty lay in the red road, shoulder burning, mouth full of dust, and saw the first person who had ever loved her disappear behind the wheels of commerce. That night, in a cabin emptied by sale, Betty made a vow, not loud, not reckless, not for the overseers to hear. She spoke it into the dark. Silas Crow would die, and history should be careful with that moment, because it was not born from cruelty. It was born from a child watching a legal system commit an unforgivable act and call it trade. If you're listening from a city built on old ports, cotton money, railroads, or buried plantations, comment your location below. Tell us what your town was forced to remember and what it was taught to forget. By the summer of 1797, Betty Moore was 5 years old enough to understand fear before she understood the laws that protected it. Hawthorne Plantation sat on 2,000 acres of Georgia soil near the Savannah River. From the road, the place pretended to be order. A white house on a rise, columns washed clean, porches wide, fields stretching outward in disciplined rows. That was the picture the owners wanted seen. But the truth stood behind the house, past the kitchen yard, where the cabins leaned into the heat and the people inside them learned to sleep lightly. Betty lived there with her mother, Ada, and the man the plantation called Jim. His real name was Kwame. That distinction matters. Slavery did not only take labor. It took names, then tried to make the theft sound ordinary. A child hearing her father renamed every day learns early that the system is not confused. It is deliberate. Kwame had been bought from another plantation 3 years earlier. He was strong, quiet, and careful, but not empty. The marks on his face still carried a history older than Georgia. He worked the fields from first light until dark, pushing a plow through hard red ground, bending under orders, and carrying himself with a dignity the overseers watched like contraband. On Hawthorne land, dignity was treated as evidence of rebellion. The overseer was Cyrus Boone. He was not an accident of the system. He was one of its tools. Men like Boone were not hired despite their cruelty. They were hired because of it. A plantation needed someone willing to make pain public, someone who could turn fear into routine. Boone rode the fields on a gray horse with a whip at his side. He looked for slow hands, bent backs that paused too long, eyes that lifted too high. He understood the performance expected of him. Punishment was not only correction, it was theater. It reminded every enslaved person that the owner's power could reach the body at any hour. That morning, the heat had settled early. The field hands had been working for hours. Cotton rows shimmered in the sun. The air itself seemed to resist breathing. Kwame stopped for a moment and wiped sweat from his face. It was not defiance. It was exhaustion. Boone saw it. He rode closer. "Get back to work." Kwame lowered his hand and answered with care. He said he was only catching his breath. He said he would continue. Then he looked up, only for a second, long enough for Boone to decide that the moment required a lesson. The bell was rung. That sound pulled people from the fields, the stables, the kitchen, the wash area. It was not the bell of worship or meals. It was the bell of warning. On plantations, even sound could be trained to carry violence. Betty stood beside Ada as the people gathered near the old oak. The tree had a function. Everyone knew it. Its bark had absorbed years of punishment. Ropes had worn marks into it. The ground beneath it had held the weight of too many bodies forced into public suffering. Kwame was tied to the post. His shirt was removed. His back faced the crowd. Elias Hawthorne watched from the porch. That detail cannot be softened. He did not swing the whip, but he owned the field, the crop, the cabins, and the man tied to the tree. He owned the conditions that made the whipping possible. His stillness was not innocence. It was authority at rest. Boone announced 20 lashes. The first strike cut the silence. Betty flinched. Ada's hand tightened around hers. No one moved. That was the design. The enslaved were made to witness the cost of a pause, the cost of eye contact, the cost of appearing too much like a man. Kwame tried not to cry out. His body jerked against the rope. Boone continued with measured force, not rushing, not losing control. The violence was disciplined. That made it worse. Betty looked at her father, then at Hawthorne. She was young, but she understood the arrangement. One man gave orders. Another carried them out. Others were made to watch. Then everyone would be sent back to work as if the day had not been split open. "Mama," Betty whispered, "why are they doing this?" Ada turned the child's face toward her, not because Betty should forget. Because she was too young to hold the full sight and stay whole. "This is what they do," Ada told her quietly. "But they do not own what is inside us." It was a dangerous lesson, not because it was false, but because it was true. By the time Boone finished, Kwame could barely stand. Men from the quarters carried him away. No doctor came from the big house. No formal complaint was written. No one recorded the act as a crime. The plantation had punished property, and property had no recognized injury. Aunt Cleo treated him that night. She was old, bent from field work, but her hands still carried knowledge. She used herbs, moss, cloth, and patience. Ada held a lamp low. Betty sat in the corner and watched the adults move with quiet urgency. Kwame turned his face to the wall. The cabin smelled of medicine, smoke, and blood. Betty did not understand healing, but she understood damage. Her father had entered the day as a man. By night, something in him had been pushed inward. He lived, but the plantation had taken a portion of his spirit and left his body behind as proof. That is one of slavery's lesser admitted methods. It did not always kill at once. Sometimes it reduced a person day by day, then made the survivor continue working. Betty watched the change. Kwame spoke less after that summer. His shoulders bent sooner. His eyes no longer carried the same light. He still loved Ada. He still touched Betty's head when he passed her. But the easy strength she remembered had been forced into silence. The lesson did not make Betty obedient. It made her observant. She learned when Boone drank. She learned which overseer walked softly and which wanted to be heard. She learned that the mistress avoided scenes of punishment but never questioned the comfort those scenes protected. She learned that Hawthorne's clean house required dirty hands to maintain it. She learned work. Small children on the plantation were not allowed childhood for long. Betty carried water, swept yards, picked up kindling, watched younger children, and later moved into field labor. Cotton tore at her fingers. Heat pressed against her back. Hunger made thoughts slow. The day began before sunrise and ended only when the plantation allowed it to end. But in the quarters, another education survived. At night, the older people told stories, not entertainment. Preservation. They spoke of Africa, of villages, healers, rivers, markets, families separated before the coast. They spoke in fragments because fragments were often all slavery left behind. Still, fragments could become a map. Ada taught Betty roots and leaves. Aunt Cleo taught caution. Uncle Thomas taught her letters. That was the most dangerous instruction of all. He worked inside the big house and had learned to read years before, under circumstances he rarely explained. He understood the risk. Teaching an enslaved child letters could bring punishment on both teacher and student. But Uncle Thomas also understood something the owners understood. Reading could loosen fear. The first lessons happened in stolen moments. A letter scratched in dirt, a sound whispered, a word erased by a bare foot before anyone entered. Betty learned quickly. She learned that marks could hold meaning. She learned that paper could preserve orders, debts, names, and sales. She learned that the same world that denied her humanity depended on written documents to organize that denial. The contradiction was not lost on her. The owners feared literacy because it gave the enslaved a way to examine the cage. To read was to see how power described itself. To read was to learn that the people making laws were not gods. They were men protecting profit. Betty carried that knowledge quietly. By 8 years old, she had seen enough to know the plantation was not a home. It was a system of managed loss. Every cabin held someone who had been taken from someone else. Every field hand had a story interrupted by sale. Every child belonged first to a ledger before belonging safely to a mother. Then Silas Crow arrived. He came in black clothes with a polished carriage and a wagon built for human transport. He greeted Hawthorne like a business partner. That is what he was. Not a stranger bringing evil from outside, but a necessary visitor to a plantation economy that converted people into cash whenever debt required it. The bell rang again. The enslaved were lined in the yard. Crow walked slowly, inspecting faces, arms, backs, teeth, ages. He looked without shame. Shame would have interfered with business. Betty stood near Ada. She felt her mother's body grow still. Crow stopped in front of Ada and took her chin in his hand. He turned her face toward the light. Hawthorne spoke of her strength and value. Crow listened. A decision passed between the men with no regard for the child standing beside her. "I'll take her." Betty moved before anyone could stop her. She ran toward Ada, screaming. Boone struck her down. She hit the dirt hard, breath knocked from her chest. From the ground, she saw chains placed on her mother's wrists. She saw Ada forced toward the wagon. She saw the door close on the woman who had birthed her in the hold of the Prosperity and carried memory across the ocean. Ada looked back once. "Remember who you are." The wagon rolled away. The plantation resumed. That is the indictment. A mother was taken. A child was left in the dirt. Men counted money. Work continued. And the law, as written then, stood with the men holding the bill of sale. That night, Betty sat inside a cabin that felt larger because Ada was gone. She did not weep loudly. She had already learned that grief could attract punishment. She folded it inward and gave it a name. Silas Crow. At 8 years old, Betty Moore made a vow in the dark. Not because she was cruel, because the world around her had made cruelty legal and called resistance sin. She would remember. 7 years passed after Ada was taken. On Hawthorne Plantation, time did not heal. It only buried evidence beneath more work. The cotton kept growing, the bells kept ringing. The cabins kept filling with the same old sounds: coughing, prayer, hunger, children learning too soon when to be quiet. By August 1807, Betty Moore was 15 years old. The plantation had already taken the soft years from her. Her father, Kwame, was dead by then, worn down after years of field labor and the breaking that followed his public punishment. Ada was gone, sold by Silas Crow and carried into the unknown. No letter came, no word came, no grave could be visited. That was one of slavery's cleanest cruelties. It did not need to kill a person in front of you. It could remove them from the record of your life and leave you to imagine every possible ending. Betty grew tall and strong under that weight. She picked cotton, carried water, cleaned when ordered, and kept her eyes trained low when white men passed. But obedience, in her case, was performance. Inside, she kept account. She remembered the ship. She remembered the whipping post. She remembered Crow's wagon. She remembered her mother's last command, "Remember who you are." The plantation saw a young enslaved woman. It did not see the archive forming inside her. Then Jonah arrived. He was brought in from Alabama, purchased to work the stables and assist with the heavy field labor. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and careful in the way enslaved men had to be careful. He understood when to speak, when to stand silent, when to become invisible in the presence of men who could ruin a life with a gesture. But there was something in him the plantation had not fully claimed. Betty noticed it before she admitted she had noticed. Jonah moved like someone who still carried an inner measure of himself, not defiant in a foolish way, not careless. But not emptied. That made him dangerous. The first time he spoke to Betty, she was carrying water from the well toward the fields. 2 buckets pulled hard at her arms. The sun sat high and punishing. Jonah stepped from near a fence post and offered to carry one. She refused. He took one anyway, not forcefully, not as ownership. As help. "My name is Jonah," he said. "I know your name," Betty answered. That should have ended it. It did not. Over the next weeks, Jonah appeared where her work took her, at the well, near the stable path, by the cotton scales at dusk. Sometimes he said nothing. Sometimes he asked about the plantation, about Boone, about which orders mattered and which men to avoid. Betty answered only what was necessary. Trust was not a habit she could afford. Still, she began listening for his step. This is not romance, as the plantation records would have dismissed it. This was 2 human beings finding a narrow space inside a system designed to make human attachment dangerous. Love between the enslaved was never private in the way free people imagine privacy. Every bond could be punished. Every promise could be interrupted by sale. Jonah understood that. Betty understood it better. One Sunday evening after worship, he passed close enough to speak without turning his head. "Old tobacco barn," he said. After the night bell. Betty kept walking. She told herself not to go. The old barn stood near the edge of the property, half abandoned, used for storage and forgotten tools. Its boards were warped. Its roof sagged. It was the kind of place the plantation overlooked because it no longer served profit every day. That made it useful. After the night bell, Betty left her cabin quietly. Jonah was waiting inside, standing in the dim light that slipped through the gaps in the wall. For a moment, neither of them moved. The silence was not empty. It held risk. "You came," he said. "I should not have." "No," he answered. "You should not have." That was the truth, and still she stayed. They met again. Then again. Their conversations were short at first. Names, places, warnings. Memories. Jonah told her his mother had been sold when he was a boy. Betty told him her mother had been taken by a trader named Silas Crow. She did not tell him at first about the vow. That came later, after trust had crossed from caution into need. When she finally said it, Jonah did not laugh. He looked toward the barn door, then back at her. "That kind of promise can bury you," he said. Betty's voice stayed level. "Some things are already buried." She told him about Ada. About the wagon. About Crow's hand on her mother's face as if he had the right to inspect sorrow before buying it. Jonah listened without interruption. That was one of the reasons she began to love him. He did not try to soften the story. He did not ask her to forgive what had never confessed itself as wrong. By late summer, the meetings became the center of their lives. They worked through the day under watch. They met when they could. They spoke of escape, but always with the hard knowledge of what escape meant. Dogs, patrols, notices, punishment, sail farther south. Death by exhaustion, exposure, or capture. Jonah had heard of routes north, of people who helped, of signs, songs, hidden roads, river crossings. Betty wanted to believe him. But belief had cost her before. "Staying here is another kind of dying," Jonah said one night. Betty did not answer, because he was right, because fear was also right. That is the trap slavery made, and then blamed the enslaved for fearing. Stay, and the system consumes you slowly. Run, and the system hunts you for wanting to live. Their affection did not remain unnoticed. Nothing did. In the quarters, people saw the glances. They saw Jonah near the well too often. They saw Betty's guarded face change when he was close. Some warned her, not because they opposed love, but because they knew what love gave the owners: leverage. Cyrus Boone noticed too. By 1807, Boone had already watched Betty change from a child into a young woman. His attention carried threat. Betty felt it when he passed near her in the yard. She knew the kind of danger that made other women go silent. She understood that her body, like her labor, was considered claimable by men who had never earned the right to speak her name. Jonah's presence angered Boone, not because any rule of morality had been broken. The plantation had no moral authority to speak of. Boone was angry because Jonah had reached something Boone believed power reserved for itself: Betty's attention, her softness, her choice. One night, the old barn door opened. Betty and Jonah turned at the same time. Boone stood in the doorway with 2 patrolmen behind him. No trial was needed. No proof was needed. The accusation was already written by power before anyone spoke. Boone stepped inside. Jonah moved in front of Betty. That small movement decided everything. The whip came down before Jonah could finish speaking. He staggered, then took another blow. Betty surged forward, but one of the patrolmen grabbed her arms and held her back. The scene was brief, controlled, and meant to instruct. Boone was not simply punishing a man. He was announcing ownership over the terms of feeling. Betty fought against the hands holding her. Jonah fell to one knee. The barn smelled of hay, sweat, and fear. Outside, the night remained quiet. That is how these crimes often occurred. Not with thunder, not with witness enough to stop them, but in ordinary darkness, close to the fields that would be worked again the next morning. Master Hawthorne arrived after the commotion reached the house. He carried a lamp. His son Thomas came behind him. Hawthorne looked at Jonah on the ground. He looked at Betty, restrained by the patrolman. He looked at Boone, breathing hard with the satisfaction of authority used. No compassion crossed his face, only calculation. Jonah had been bought 4 months earlier. Strong worker. Good value, now injured, now attached to trouble, now a risk. Hawthorne made the decision with the calm of a man adjusting an account. Send for Silas Crow. Betty heard the name and felt the past open under her feet. Crow. The man who had taken Ada. The man her 8-year-old self had sworn to kill. By morning, Jonah would be sold to him. Betty begged. The words came before pride could stop them. She offered work. Silence. Anything. It did not matter. Her plea entered the air and died there because the plantation did not recognize her as someone withstanding to plead. Jonah was dragged away and locked for the night. Betty returned to her cabin before dawn with dirt on her dress and terror sitting cold in her chest. She did not sleep. She pressed one hand against her stomach, where a secret had already begun to change the shape of her future. Jonah's child was growing inside her. At sunrise, Silas Crow arrived in his black carriage. He looked older than he had 7 years before, but not changed. Men like Crow aged inside the protection of profit, gray at the temples, better clothes, same dead attention. Jonah was brought out in chains. Crow inspected him the way he had inspected Ada. Teeth, shoulders, arms, injuries. Usefulness. Then he named the price, $600. That was the official value placed on Jonah's life, his labor, his love, his unborn child, and every future stolen from him before it could happen. Money changed hands. Paper was signed. The law approved. Jonah looked at Betty once as he was pushed toward the wagon. There was no time for promises worth believing. Still, he gave one. I'll find my way back. A fist cut the words short. The wagon door closed. Betty stood in the yard with her hand over her stomach and watched Silas Crow take another person she loved down the same road that had swallowed her mother. The plantation returned to work. That is what must be remembered. Not only the violence, but the return to work afterward, the ordinary continuation, the field rows waiting, the breakfast dishes in the big house, the ledger updated. The wound made private by everyone with the power to pretend nothing had happened. That night, Betty did not make a new vow. She added to the old one. Crow had taken Ada, now Crow had taken Jonah. And inside Betty, a child carried the evidence that even in bondage, love had existed without permission. In February 1808, the child came during a cold night on Hawthorne Plantation. The wind moved through the cracks of the cabin walls. The fire was low. Betty Moore was 16 years old, alone in every way the plantation could arrange, and carrying the child of a man sold away before sunrise. Her labor began while she was preparing a thin meal of cornmeal and water. The pain took her by the spine and forced her against the table. A woman in the cabin called for Aunt Cleo, and within minutes the old midwife arrived with rags, herbs, and the hard calm of someone who had delivered too many enslaved children into a world that would not protect them. No doctor came from the big house. No owner stood at the door in concern. To Hawthorne, the birth meant future labor. To Betty, it meant the last living trace of Jonah. That difference is the moral crime at the center of the record. Aunt Cleo worked by candlelight. Other women gathered quietly. They had been in the fields all day, and most would return before sunrise, but they came because enslaved women had learned to create care where the law allowed none. One held water, one warmed cloth near the fire, one whispered a prayer low enough not to invite attention. Betty gripped the edge of the pallet and pushed. Hours passed, the cabin filled with heat, breath, and pain. Outside, frost lay over the ground. Inside, a girl not yet fully grown fought to bring another girl into the world. Near dawn, the baby cried. Aunt Cleo lifted her, wiped her face, and placed her against Betty's chest. The child was small, strong-lunged, and alive. Betty held her with both hands as if the world might reach in and take her at once. She named her Sarah. The name mattered. Under slavery, naming was an act of claim. Owners renamed the living to prove control. Mothers named their children to prove memory. Betty had been born in chains and sold before she understood speech. She gave her daughter a name before the ledger could reduce her to a number. Sarah had Jonah's nose and Betty's eyes. That was the first evidence of love the plantation could not erase. In the weeks after the birth, Betty was given no real recovery. The body that had labored through childbirth was expected to return to labor for the estate. She carried Sarah to the field in a cloth sling. The baby pressed against her back while cotton scraped Betty's fingers and sun burned the rows. This was routine. That is what must be understood. The horror was not always a single event. Often it was a schedule, a mother nursing between tasks. A child sleeping at the edge of a field, a woman bending over crops while her body still carried the damage of birth. The system did not pause for pain. It calculated through it. Sarah survived. She grew among the cabins under the care of women who watched one another's children because plantation work made private motherhood nearly impossible. She crawled in the dirt near the quarters. She learned to walk between smoke, field tools, and warning calls. She learned early that the main house was not a place of safety. She learned which voices meant hide, which meant run, which meant lower your eyes. Betty loved her fiercely, but she did not raise her gently. There was no safe gentleness to offer. By the time Sarah could speak, Betty was already teaching her the first rules of survival. Do not stare too long. Do not answer too quickly. Do not be seen knowing more than they expect. Move when ordered. Remember what you are told to forget. The last rule was the most important. At night, when work ended and the quarters settled into exhaustion, Betty told Sarah about Ada. Not everything at first. A child should not have to inherit the full weight of a slave ship. But Sarah learned that her grandmother had been born free in Africa, stolen, carried across the Atlantic, and sold in Savannah. She learned that Betty had been born at sea. She learned that families could be broken by men who called themselves respectable. The lessons were not meant to poison the child. They were meant to keep her human. A people cannot survive if every generation is forced to begin with amnesia. When Sarah turned 5, Betty began the forbidden lesson. Letters. The first marks were scratched into the dirt floor of the cabin after dark. Betty used a twig, then her finger. She made the shapes slowly, then erased them with her palm. Sarah watched with bright, serious eyes. A, B, C. The alphabet entered the room like contraband. Betty had learned from Uncle Thomas before his death, and he had told her to pass the knowledge on. That instruction became a duty. Reading was not a hobby on Hawthorne Plantation. It was not refinement. It was danger. It allowed the enslaved to recognize notices, passes, prices, laws, and lies. It gave form to things the owners preferred hidden behind spoken command. Betty understood why they feared it. A person who could read could learn how the world described freedom. A person who could read could see that the Bible used in the big house contained more than obedience. A person who could read could understand that a bill of sale was not truth. It was evidence of a crime protected by law. Sarah learned quickly. At first, she repeated sounds. Then she recognized letters. Then short words. Betty taught her from scraps, from memory, from stolen glances at pages inside the big house. Some nights she used lines from scripture she had heard in Sunday service. Other nights she created lessons from the world around them. A was for ancestor. B was for bondage. C was for courage. Each word carried a warning. Knowledge could help Sarah live, but knowledge could also get her punished. So Betty taught her secrecy with the same care she taught letters. Learn, then hide the learning. Read, then look ignorant. Carry power, but do not display it before those who would fear it. That is another indictment. A child had to be trained to conceal her intelligence because intelligence threatened the comfort of her captors. Years passed. By 1815, Sarah was 7 and could read simple words. By 1816, she could follow short passages when Betty whispered them in the dark. By 1817, she asked questions that made Betty proud and afraid in equal measure. "Why don't they want us to know?" Sarah asked one night. Betty did not answer quickly, because the answer was larger than a child, but the child needed it. "Because knowing proves they lied," she said. Sarah looked down at the dirt where letters had been erased. That was enough for the moment. The risk became real in the summer of 1817 when Sarah was 9. The day was hot. Work had slowed under the weight of the sun. Sarah sat near the cabin yard waiting for Betty and scratched letters into dry dirt with a stick. She was careful, but children are not machines. For 1 minute, she forgot to look behind her. Thomas Hawthorne saw her. He was Elias Hawthorne's son, recently more involved in plantation affairs as his father aged. He was educated, quieter than Boone, less openly brutal than the overseers before him. That did not make him innocent. A polished hand can still hold ownership. A soft voice can still benefit from chains. He stood over Sarah and watched the letters take shape. The child froze. She wiped the dirt with her foot. "What were you writing?" he asked. Sarah said nothing. Betty saw from the garden and moved fast, placing herself between Thomas and her daughter. Her body knew the danger before her mind could form a plan. She denied what he had seen. She said Sarah was only playing. She said children made marks all the time. Thomas looked at Betty, then at the dirt, then back at Betty. "You taught her," he said. It was not a question. For a moment, the entire future narrowed to the space between them. Betty could lie and fail. She could admit the truth and condemn them both. She lifted her chin just enough to answer without begging. No public punishment came. Thomas made a choice that should not be mistaken for justice. He told Betty to keep it hidden. He told her not to let others see. He told her never to say he knew. Then he walked away. Betty stood still until he was gone. Only then did she take Sarah inside. That night she held her daughter close and did not celebrate. Mercy under slavery was never secure. It depended on mood, secrecy, convenience, and the silence of those with power. Thomas had spared them that day, but he had not changed the system that made sparing necessary. By 1820, Elias Hawthorne was old and indebted. The plantation's appearance remained orderly from the road, but inside the accounts, pressure was building. Cotton prices shifted, loans came due, creditors circled. When white planters lost money, enslaved families paid the debt with their bodies. Rumors moved through the quarters before any official word came. Someone would be sold, maybe 2, maybe more. Betty heard the whispers and watched Sarah, now 12, growing tall, intelligent, and beautiful in a world where every one of those qualities could become a danger. She saw men from the big house begin to notice. She saw traders pass through more often. She saw Hawthorne's son carrying ledgers and speaking in low tones with buyers. At night, Betty prayed with one hand on Sarah's shoulder, not because prayer had protected Ada, not because prayer had brought Jonah back, but because a mother will still speak into the dark when there is no court, no law, and no human authority willing to defend her child. In October 1820, the auction bell rang again. Betty knew the sound before anyone told her what it meant. She reached for Sarah. Across the yard, a black carriage had arrived. Silas Crow stepped down from it, older now, gray at the temples, dressed like a man attending business rather than a man entering the scene of another family's destruction. Betty saw him look across the gathered people. Then she saw his eyes stop on Sarah. Silas Crow looked at Sarah as if he had found a coin in the dirt. That look told Betty what the morning would become before any price was spoken. It was the same look he had given Ada 20 years earlier, the same measured attention, the same absence of shame. A traitor did not need hatred in his face to destroy a family. But plantation records were not written to tell moral truth. They were written to protect ownership. The enslaved people stood in the yard under the late morning sun. No one spoke. Silence did not mean consent. It meant everyone present understood the penalty for protest. Betty held Sarah's arm, firm enough to hurt. Sarah leaned into her mother's side, trying to make herself smaller. Crow spoke with Elias Hawthorne and his son Thomas near the porch. Elias was older now. His face had thinned. His hands trembled when he held the railing. But age had not made him righteous. It had only made his debts more urgent. The plantation still needed money. The quickest money stood in the yard, breathing. Crow pointed. The girl. Betty felt Sarah stiffen. Thomas Hawthorne opened the ledger. He did not look at Betty. He looked down at the page, where Sarah existed as age, sex, condition, and value. That was how the crime protected itself. It turned a child into categories before turning her into cash. 12, Thomas said. Healthy. House-trained. Quick learner. He did not say she could read. That omission saved him from admitting what he knew. It did not save Sarah. Crow walked closer. Betty moved half a step in front of her daughter. It was a small movement, useless against law, men, and chains. But it was the movement of a mother refusing to surrender the child before the child was taken. Crow smiled. The smile was for business, not kindness. He asked whether Sarah had been difficult, whether she had been trained in the house, whether she obeyed. Hawthorne answered like a seller describing livestock. Clean. Strong, useful, old enough to work, young enough to shape. Then Crow named Charleston. That word crossed the yard like a sentence. Charleston meant distance, market, buyers, houses where children disappeared into rooms their mothers would never see. It meant Sarah would not be just down the road. She would be gone into the machinery of sale, and machinery does not grieve. Betty stepped forward and dropped to her knees before Hawthorne. This was not submission. It was desperation forced into the only posture power would recognize. She begged, not for freedom, not for justice, only for the right to keep her child beside her. She offered more labor. Longer hours. Silence. Anything. Her voice stayed low at first, controlled by the discipline of survival. Then it broke because no discipline can hold forever against the sight of a child being priced. Hawthorne looked away. Thomas's face tightened, but he did not stop it. That matters. History has too often excused the uncomfortable man standing beside the cruel act. But discomfort without intervention is only manners. Thomas had known Sarah's mind. He had watched her scratch letters in dirt and spared her once. Now, when mercy required more than secrecy, he let the sale proceed. Crow suggested buying Betty with the girl. For one brief second, hope entered the yard. Betty heard it and seized on it. If they had to be sold, at least they might remain together. She looked at Sarah. Sarah looked back, tearful, trembling, still a child despite the way the men spoke of her future usefulness. But Hawthorne refused. Betty was too valuable on the plantation. She knew the household work. His wife depended on her. The field still used her. Her body had been calculated into too many routines. So the bargain narrowed. Sarah alone. The men settled the matter in words short enough for any court of conscience to condemn. A price. A nod. An agreement. Then the chains came out. Betty rose before they reached Sarah. Two men caught her. She fought with the force of every loss that had come before. Ada pulled away in Crow's wagon, Jonah sold before sunrise, Kwame broken under the oak. Every night Sarah had slept against her chest while Betty promised silently that she would not let the world take this one too. She struck one man across the face. Another grabbed her from behind. She kicked, twisted, nearly broke free. The yard erupted in movement, but not rescue. The other enslaved people were forced to watch, held in place by the same terror that had kept them standing at the whipping post years before. Sarah cried out for her mother. That sound should be entered into the record before any bill of sale, not the price, not the signatures. The sound of a child calling for the only protection she had ever known. They put iron on Sarah's wrists. The metal looked too large for her. Betty saw it and changed. Something inside her went past fear. Her voice rose, not pleading now, but accusing. She shouted Crow's name. She told him he had taken her mother. She told him he had taken Jonah. She told him if he took Sarah, he would carry a debt no money could settle. Crow did not answer. Men like him survived by never hearing the human meaning of their work. Sarah was pushed toward the wagon. Betty screamed the only instructions that mattered. Remember who you are. Remember you can read. Remember the ancestors. Remember your mother. The door closed. For a moment, Sarah's face appeared between the wooden slats. Her cheeks were wet. Her mouth formed words Betty could not fully hear over the noise in the yard. Then the driver cracked the reins, and the wagon began to move. Betty broke free. She ran after it. The road was dry. Dust rose around her feet. She stumbled once, got up, and kept running. Men shouted behind her. Someone called her name. None of it reached her. She reached for the wagon as if will alone could pull it back. The horses moved faster. Sarah's face disappeared into distance. Betty fell in the road. Her hands dug into red clay until dirt packed beneath her nails. The wagon turned beyond the trees and was gone. That is where the official story would have ended, if the official story cared to tell it at all. One enslaved child transferred from one owner to another. But the real story remained in the road, a mother left on the ground, a trader leaving with a child. A plantation returning to its schedule. That evening, Betty was carried back to her cabin. She did not walk there. Her body moved, but the will inside it had gone somewhere unreachable. The women laid her down. Aunt Cleo stayed beside her, old hands resting near Betty's wrist, listening to the breath that proved she was still alive. Betty did not eat. She did not speak. For 3 days, she lay with her face turned toward the wall. The overseers did not force her back to work immediately. Not from mercy. They understood that some griefs made a person temporarily useless. Even cruelty waits when profit requires a body to function again. At night, the quarters quieted around her. Aunt Cleo sang low. Not to comfort exactly. Comfort was too small a word. She sang because silence would have made Sarah's absence larger. She sang old spirituals about crossing rivers, laying burdens down, and reaching a land where no auction bell could follow. Betty heard none of it. She heard only Sarah calling, "Mama." On the 4th morning she sat up. The women noticed immediately. Her eyes had changed. The emptiness was gone. Something harder had taken its place. Grief had not left her. It had condensed. She walked out of the cabin before anyone could stop her. The yard was damp from early mist. The old oak stood near the field road, the whipping post that had taught her what the plantation was when she was 5. Betty went to it and placed her hand against the bark. The tree had witnessed her father's punishment. It had witnessed too many bodies offered up to power. Now it witnessed a vow spoken plainly. Silas Crow had taken Ada. Silas Crow had taken Jonah. Silas Crow had taken Sarah, and he had made one mistake. He had left Betty alive. This was not madness. It was conclusion. The law had failed her because the law had been built to fail her. The church had not protected her. The master's house had not protected her. Polite discomfort had not protected Sarah. Every official channel of mercy had been closed by design. So memory became the court, and Betty became the witness who would not recant. After Sarah's sale, she returned to labor, but not as before. Her hands moved through cotton. Her feet walked the rows. Her body obeyed enough to survive, but the part of her that had once negotiated with hope was gone. The plantation noticed. She no longer lowered her eyes quickly enough. She answered with just enough respect to avoid immediate punishment, but not enough to disguise contempt. When orders came, she moved slowly. When watched, she did not shrink. The other enslaved people warned her. Aunt Cleo warned her most of all. A woman with nothing left to lose was powerful, but power without patience could become a grave. Betty listened, but listening was not the same as agreeing. Her life had been reduced by sale after sale until only one purpose remained. She would survive long enough to meet Crow again. Years moved forward. The plantation aged. Owners shifted. Overseers came and went. The names and power changed, but the system kept its shape. Betty carried scars, knowledge, and a hatred disciplined enough to wait. That is what should be remembered about her. Not only the final act, the waiting, the years of forced work after the child was taken, the mornings she rose while Sarah was somewhere beyond reach. The nights she lay awake reconstructing her daughter's face so the world could not steal that too. The silence she used as a hiding place for judgment. History often asks the oppressed to be noble in ways it never demanded from their oppressors. It asks for patience, forgiveness, and restraint after removing every lawful path to justice. Betty Moore's life exposes that demand for what it is. Another chain. By August 1844, Betty Moore had become the kind of woman slavery never knew how to read. The plantation still saw her as labor, a set of hands, a back that could bend, a body that could be counted, but the visible record was incomplete. Inside Betty lived another record, Ada taken in chains, Kwame tied to the oak, Jonah sold at dawn, Sarah carried away behind wooden slats, every wound converted into memory. That is what the owners failed to understand. They believed pain made people smaller. Sometimes it does, but sometimes pain removes every distraction until only judgment remains. Silas Crow returned to Hawthorne land with buyers, wagons, and paper. He was older now. His hair had thinned at the temples. His clothes were finer. His business had expanded south, toward Mobile, Alabama, where the trade in black bodies fed the cotton country like fuel into a furnace. Crow had not reformed. He had prospered. That detail deserves to be named plainly. Men like Crow were not punished by the world they served. They were rewarded by it. He came to Hawthorne Plantation to buy 20 people, maybe more. Debt had eaten again at the estate. The same pattern repeated itself with the dull precision of machinery. Crops failed, accounts tightened, white men negotiated, black families paid the price. Betty was working in the garden when Crow saw her. He stopped. Maybe he recognized her. Maybe not. To a man who had sold hundreds, perhaps thousands, memory worked differently. He could remember prices better than faces, but Betty remembered him with the accuracy of a scar. Crow walked toward her through the rows, crushing vegetables beneath his boots. Hawthorne followed. The overseer Pike followed too, pleased already because Betty had become a problem to him. She answered slowly. She looked too directly. She had been punished the month before for refusing the full performance of fear. Crow examined her with the same commercial attention he once gave Ada and Sarah. How old is she? Hawthorne described her value. Skilled, strong, experienced in the household, difficult when provoked, useful despite her fire. Crow heard the word fire and smiled. That smile was not admiration, it was appetite. He offered $800. Hawthorne refused at first. Betty knew too much of the house. Mistress Hawthorne relied on her. She trained younger women. She understood the rhythms of the plantation. Convenience in that moment stood between Betty and Crow. Then Crow raised the price, $1,000. Then $1,200. The number changed the air. Hawthorne hesitated. That hesitation told the truth of ownership more clearly than any sermon could. A woman who had lived on that land since infancy, who had buried grief into its soil, who had served the household for decades, became negotiable the moment the price rose high enough. Crow wanted her especially. Betty saw it in his face. He did not want only labor. He wanted to test himself against the woman who did not lower her hatred fast enough. He wanted to own what had refused to disappear. For 3 days, the decision waited. In the quarters, the news moved quietly from cabin to cabin. Silas Crow wanted Betty Moore. Some pitied her. Some feared what would happen if she were taken to Mobile. Crow's operation had a reputation. People brought there were not merely worked. They were processed, punished, resold, and used until there was little left to recover. Aunt Cleo came to Betty after dark. The old woman found her sitting alone, not weeping, not speaking, staring into the space where a future might have been if any future had been allowed to remain intact. "You thinking of running?" Aunt Cleo asked. Betty shook her head. There was nowhere to run yet. Patrols watched the roads. Dogs followed scent. Notices traveled faster than feet. Escape required more than courage. It required timing, maps, allies, and luck. Betty had none of those. But Crow was offering something else, access. If he bought her, he would take her closer to the center of his own house, closer to his schedules. His habits, his rooms, his confidence, closer to the man himself. Aunt Cleo understood before Betty finished speaking. Her face tightened with fear, not surprise. She warned Betty that killing a white trader would bring a terrible answer from every authority within reach. Betty listened. Then she answered without heat. Crow had taken her mother. He had taken Jonah. He had taken Sarah. He had walked away from each theft protected by paper, money, and law. If law would not name him guilty, Betty would. Aunt Cleo reached into her apron and pulled out a small cloth bundle tied with red thread. She told Betty to wear it hidden, root, dust, old protection, old belief. Whether one calls it medicine, faith, memory, or magic depends on who is telling the story. What matters is this. In a world that denied black people every legal defense, the enslaved made protection from what remained to them. Hands. Herbs, prayer, ancestors. Betty tied the bundle beneath her dress. 3 days later, Hawthorne sold her to Silas Crow for $1,200. She was loaded into a wagon with 20 others. The road to Mobile took 3 days. Heat pressed down, chains sounded against wood. Crow rode ahead at times, then beside them, laughing with drivers, discussing prices, routes, and buyers. Betty sat among the others and watched him through the slats. She did not look away. The compound outside Mobile was not a plantation in the ordinary sense. It was a hub, a holding ground. A place where people were gathered, disciplined, inspected, and moved deeper into the market. High fences surrounded the property. Guards walked with dogs. Buildings stood in rows. Quarters, barns, storage rooms, punishment spaces, the main house pretending to be respectable at the center. Respectability has always been one of evil's preferred disguises. Crow's house was 2 stories, clean from the front, rotten in purpose. His wife lived inside it, pale and nervous, dependent on medicine and distance. She rarely left her room. Her silence, like Hawthorne's silence before her, served the system well. Betty was assigned to the main house. She cooked, cleaned, carried trays, washed linens, and learned the geography of Crow's life. His study was upstairs. His ledgers were kept in locked drawers. He drank at night. He met buyers behind closed doors. He counted people in columns. She saw names written beside prices. She saw numbers beside ages. She saw the architecture of the crime in ink. For the first weeks, Betty obeyed enough to study him. She kept her face still. She moved where ordered. She listened. That was the discipline years of survival had taught her. Do not waste rage where it cannot yet strike. But Crow was watching her too. He had not paid $1,200 for obedience already secured. He wanted submission as proof of conquest. He called her to his study one evening and spoke to her across a polished desk covered in papers. He said Hawthorne had warned him she was difficult. He said he liked difficult ones. He said fire could be useful once properly directed. Betty stood in front of him and said nothing. Crow rose and circled her. He spoke of the seasoning house, of 3 days there, of what he believed would remind her of her place. He used the language of correction, but the meaning was clear. He intended to break what remained. Betty answered with one word, no. Crow stopped. The room changed. For a man like Crow, refusal from an enslaved black woman was not simply disobedience. It was an attack on the entire fiction that made him powerful. He demanded she repeat herself. Betty did. She named what he had done. Ada. Jonah. Sarah. She named her daughter as a child who could read, as a child sold anyway. She told Crow he had already taken everything he could use to frighten her. He lunged. Betty struck him. For 1 second, the study held the impossible. Silas Crow, trader of human beings, stunned by the hand of a woman he had purchased. Then the door opened. Overseers rushed in and seized her. Crow's face had gone red with humiliation. That humiliation mattered. Violence often follows not because power is strong, but because power has been embarrassed. He ordered public punishment, 100 lashes, then 3 days in the hole. The compound gathered to watch. Betty was taken to the post and tied. The whip rose. The first strike landed, then another. Then another. The count became less important than the purpose. Crow wanted every person on that ground to see what happened when his authority was challenged. Betty did not give him what he wanted easily. She endured until her body could no longer keep silence. Even then, the sound that came from her was not surrender. It was fury forced through pain. After the whipping, they dragged her to the hole. It was a pit cut into the ground, covered by a wooden grate. Too narrow for rest. Too dark for time. No real food, little water, heat by day, cold by night. In that place, a body had only breath and memory. For 3 days, Betty drifted in and out of fever. She saw Ada on the ship, Jonah in chains, Sarah behind the wagon slats. Crow's face, over and over, still alive. When they pulled her out, she could barely stand. The women in the quarters treated her wounds with what little they had. One of them, Essie, said Crow must have wanted her alive. Otherwise, he would have left her there to die. Betty knew why. He had paid too much money. That was the bitter protection of the ledger. Crow would harm her, but he would not willingly waste his investment. Even his restraint was not mercy. It was accounting. That night, a young man named Isaiah came quietly to her pallet. He said Marcus had sent him. There was a plan. October 31st, 1844. They would run when the night was long, when guards drank, when the compound loosened into its own arrogance. Supplies had been hidden. A route had been marked. The North Star would guide them toward Tennessee, then beyond, if they lived long enough to reach the next hands willing to help. Isaiah asked if she was strong enough to run. Betty's body was torn, infected, and shaking with fever. She looked at him and answered plainly. She would crawl if she had to. From that night on, Betty performed obedience better than she ever had. She lowered her eyes. She answered softly. She moved slowly enough to seem broken. Crow watched and believed what he wanted to believe. That was his mistake. He thought punishment had emptied her. It had clarified her. 14 days remained until October 31st. 14 days to heal. 14 days to memorize the compound. 14 days to decide whether freedom alone would be enough. Betty already knew the answer. October 31st, 1844, did not begin like a day of judgment. It began with work. At Silas Crow's compound outside Mobile, Alabama, the morning bell rang before first light. Men and women rose from the quarters with sore backs, swollen hands, and faces trained into caution. Guards walked the fence line. Dogs moved near the gate. The main house stood clean and white in the distance, pretending not to know what paid for its boards, its curtains, its locked study, its polished desk. Betty Moore moved through that morning slowly, not weak. Measured. The wounds on her back had not healed cleanly. Every reach pulled at torn skin. Every step reminded her of the pit, the darkness, the 3 days Crow had ordered after she struck him in his own study. But pain had become information. It told her what she could still do. It told her where her body might fail. It told her how much time she had. 14 days earlier, Isaiah had whispered the plan. Tonight. After the evening meal, after Crow began drinking, after the guards grew loose with cards and whiskey, Marcus would cut the first fence rope near the tool shed. Essie would carry corn cakes wrapped in cloth. Isaiah had a file hidden under a loose floorboard. Betty's task was to reach the north gate after the second watch passed. That was the plan as spoken, but Betty had carried another plan in silence. By sundown, the compound shifted into its night rhythm. Work ended. Chains were counted. Doors were checked. The guards laughed near the stable. In the house, Crow ate heavily and drank harder. Betty served at table with her eyes lowered, hands steady, face emptied of all accusation. Crow watched her. He believed he had won. That was the arrogance that protected men like him. They mistook silence for surrender because surrender was the only language they respected. After supper, Crow went to his study. Betty cleared plates, washed them, dried them, and placed them in order. She moved through the kitchen. No one stopped her. She had become, in their eyes, useful again. Broken enough to trust with routine. That, too, was part of the evidence. Slavery survived by forcing people into patterns, then believing the patterns meant obedience. Near the rear hall, Betty paused. Outside, beyond the window, she saw Marcus cross the yard with a feed sack over his shoulder. He did not look toward her. That was the signal. The first cut had been made. She should have gone to the north gate. Instead, she turned toward the storage room. A pitchfork leaned against the wall among rakes, hoes, and field tools. Ordinary iron, a thing meant for hay, stalls, labor. In Betty's hand, it became something else. Not revenge alone. Not rage alone. A record sharpened to a point. She carried it low, close to her skirt. The hallway to Crow's study was dim. The house was quieter than it should have been. Somewhere upstairs, Crow's wife coughed behind a closed door. Somewhere outside, a dog barked once and fell silent. Betty reached the study door. It was not locked. Inside, Silas Crow sat at his desk with a glass beside his hand and ledgers open in front of him. Names filled the pages, ages, prices, descriptions, destination. The dead language of commerce pretending it had not participated in a moral crime. Crow looked up. For a moment, he did not understand what he was seeing. Betty Moore, standing in the doorway after dark, holding a tool from the yard. Then his face hardened. "You lost your way," he said. Betty stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The room smelled of paper, tobacco, and oil lamp smoke. On the desk lay the proof of his life's work: bills of sale, shipping notes, debt accounts, names reduced to figures. Betty saw no law there. Only confession. Crow stood. He reached toward the drawer where he kept a pistol. Betty moved first. The pitchfork drove forward with the strength left in her body and the strength of every person Crow had believed he could turn into currency. The iron struck him before his hand found the drawer. He fell back against the desk, knocking over the glass, scattering papers across the floor. There was a sound, but not the kind history should linger on. What matters is this: the man who had bought Ada, sold Jonah, taken Sarah, and paid $1,200 for Betty Moore was finally forced to face someone he could not price his way out of. Crow looked at her with shock. Not remorse. Shock. Even at the end, he seemed offended that property had judged him. Betty stood over him, breathing hard. Her hands shook now. Not from fear, from the body's delayed knowledge of what had happened. She looked at the ledgers scattered at her feet and saw in ink the shape of a nation's lie. "You wrote us down," she said, "but you never owned what mattered." Then she took the keys from his belt. Outside, the first alarm rose near the far fence. A shout, a dog barking, a guard cursing in the dark. The escape had begun. Betty left the study by the back hall. She did not run at first. Running too soon would draw the eye. She moved through the kitchen, past the cold hearth, out the rear door, and into the yard. Smoke from the quarters drifted low across the ground. Figures moved between shadows. Marcus was at the fence. Isaiah was cutting iron from a woman's wrist with shaking hands. Essie held the food bundle against her chest. Betty reached them with Crow's keys. No one asked what had happened in the house. They saw the pitchfork no longer in her hand. They saw the keys. They understood enough. The north gate opened. 7 people slipped through first, then 3 more. A child was carried under a blanket to keep her from crying. The night did not protect them kindly. It only gave them darkness, and darkness was not mercy. It was opportunity. Behind them, the compound erupted. A bell clanged. Men shouted Crow's name. A lantern appeared near the house. Then another. The dogs were released. The fugitives entered the tree line and broke north. They moved without torches. They used creek beds when they could, rocks when they crossed open ground, water when they needed to break scent. Betty's back burned. Twice she nearly fell. Isaiah pulled her up once. Marcus pulled her up the second time. By dawn, they were miles from Mobile. Not free. Far from free. Freedom was not a moment. It was a distance measured in hunger, cold, pursuit, and the willingness of strangers to risk their own lives. For days they moved through Alabama woods, hiding in ravines and abandoned sheds. One man turned back after his feet swelled too badly to continue. Betty never learned whether he survived. That is another cruelty of such journeys. Escape did not always produce endings. Often it produced unanswered names. In Tennessee, a black preacher hid them beneath a church floor for one night. He gave them water, dried meat, and directions spoken so quietly that even the walls seemed to listen. He did not ask what they had done. He asked only how many were still behind them. In Kentucky, the group split. Some headed west, trusting a different guide. Betty stayed with Isaiah, Essie, and the child. The roads were watched. Notices had gone out. Crow's death had made the search more vicious. The authorities did not mourn the people he had sold. They mourned the collapse of order his death represented. That is the accusation. A traitor could spend his life destroying families, and society called it business. An enslaved woman could strike back once, and society called it horror. Near the Ohio River, winter began to harden the ground. They waited 3 nights before crossing. The man who came for them had no lantern. He guided them by whisper and touch. The river was black, wide, and cold enough to punish every breath. Betty stepped into the boat and thought of the Atlantic, of the ship where she had been born, of Ada laboring in chains on water meant to erase them. This river was different, not because water had changed, because this time Betty was moving herself toward life. They crossed before dawn. By spring 1845, Betty Moore reached Canada. She arrived with scars, fever damage, and no proof of herself except memory. She took work near Toronto, cleaned rooms, cooked, washed, and asked questions whenever travelers came through from the south. For 10 years she listened for one name: Sarah. In 1855, a woman came to the settlement carrying a worn cloth bundle and a guarded face. She was 27, with Jonah's nose and Betty's eyes. She had survived Charleston, resale, violence, escape, and years of silence. She could still read. Betty knew her before the woman spoke. Sarah knew her mother by the scar near her shoulder and by the words Betty had shouted as the wagon took her away. Remember who you are. The reunion did not repair what had been done. No reunion can return the stolen years. It did not absolve the men who sold them or the laws that protected the sale. It did not make suffering useful or holy. It proved something colder. They had failed to erase the line. Ada remembered. Betty remembered. Sarah remembered. And memory, carried across water, fields, sale yards, punishment posts, locked rooms, and borders, became the one record no traitor could burn. Subscribe if you believe stories like Betty Moore's should not stay buried. Comment your location below, not just where you are watching from, but what history your ground may be hiding. And if you have a theory about Sarah's missing years, Crow's ledgers, or the names erased from this case, leave it in the comments. The archive is not closed.